Our next speaker is Edinburgh-born Alan Melville. He's 53 and works in life assurance. He holds master's degrees in maths and computing. He enjoys American football, being a fan of the Denver Broncos for 30 years, as well as music and science fiction. Alan joined the UK Independence Party to help safeguard the UK's civil liberties. He was the party's general election candidate in the Edinburgh North and Leith constituency in 2015 and the lead candidate for the Scottish Parliament elections in 2016. Alan is an active member of the No to MP, the campaign against the named person scheme.
I'll try to be brief. I'd like to begin, if I may, with a quotation. There's going to be a couple of quotations in this. But this is the first one. I'll ask you if you recognise it. It's 5 questions. What power do you have? Who gave it to you? In whose name do you wield it? To whom are you accountable? How do we get rid of you? Does anybody recognise those 5 questions?
Absolutely, I thought the very same questions we wanted all Scotland to be independent.
Tony Benn. Tony Benn's questions to the powerful. Now, if we look at the European Union, you'll find that they're quite nasty when we look at this. So, what power does it have? Well, as Alex has already gone into, it has extensive powers. The EU Commission has the sole right to initiate legislation. That's unelected commissioners, that's not the Parliament. The interpretation of all these regulations is in the hands of the appointed European Court of Justice. Moreover, the ECJ can, and indeed has, overridden acts of Parliament, both in the UK and elsewhere. For example, in 1991, it struck down an act passed by the House of Commons, which would have reserved the British fishing quota to British fishermen. Seemed perfectly sensible to me. If it's a British fishing quota, it should go to British fishermen, right? No. ECJ said that's not right, we're not going to accept it. You must accept bids from other countries. The result is there's a Dutch trawler takes 6% of the entire North Sea based on the British fishing quota. But of course, it can act to strike down any other act. So they don't have to be acts that we've just tried to put forward. They can be previous acts. They could strike down, off the top of my head, the Equal Pay Act 1970. Maybe the Trade Union Recognition Act in 1871. That could be struck down if the ECJ decides it doesn't fit the European Charter or European Treaty. So who gave them these powers? Well, in theory, our governments did. They signed treaties. In practice, as Alex has already mentioned, the treaties are deliberately designed to allow bureaucrats to take more power. Little regulations that depend on other regulations. So the acquis communautaire, as it is known, where the EU acquires powers to itself and never gives them back again, is a one-way ratchet, centralising power in the name of the EU. And that is, of course, in whose name it acts. Because it doesn't act in our name. It's not we didn't elect it. Jean-Claude Juncker said, I was going to give you some quotes, here's one. We are observing an increasing gap between public opinions and the European policymakers. Unfortunately, there is no European public opinion. The public opinions are still divided in national categories. So the President of the EU Commission admits that there is no European demos to give the EU legitimacy. But it wields things in its own name anyway. To whom are they accountable? I think Alex has already covered that very well with the spaghetti example. They're not elected, there's no obvious boss. The EU Council can, in theory, demand actions of them, but in practice, the Council needs unanimous agreement. One country can veto it, so it's not You're never going to get total agreement. The result is the bureaucrats can do what they like. As I said, I hesitate to quote Tony Benn twice in 5 minutes, but when he said, "Here were these people with more power than I had and no accountability to anybody," which he put in his diary 18th of June 1974, I think, he was right. They're not accountable. But most importantly, how do we get rid of them? Well, we don't. We can't. They're not accountable to us. The EU Parliament can, in theory, get rid of commissioners, but they have to fire the entire commission. They can't fire an individual. It's the nuclear option. In practice, if a commissioner is not good at their job or is corrupt, the best you can do is wait out the term and hope that the next commissioner is better. You worried yet? Okay, let's move on to a few actual examples. Is anyone here on Facebook or Twitter? Yeah? Did any of you notice the agreement signed last week between Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, Google, and the EU on the Code of Conduct? Yes? In brief, the new Code of Conduct will require, and I'm quoting, national governments to use their law enforcement agencies to criminalise perceived illegal hate speech online and to censor it within 24 hours. Twitter and Facebook will, being who they are, go further, educating, I quote, informing their users online and promoting EU-approved counter-narratives to this nasty hate speech. Now, I can see a few people in this country, probably people who buy and read The Guardian, saying, what's wrong with that? We already have anti-hate speech laws. Well, we do. But there are a few things wrong with it. First, there's a practical one. Who decides what's hate speech? It's never been defined in law, EU or UK. So it's open to wide and very varying interpretations, much like the infamous Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which banned sectarian songs but didn't tell us what songs are sectarian. The hate speech is not defined. You don't know what words or phrases you can be censored for or arrested for or charged with. Worse than that, though, it's not going to be enforced by governments. It's going to be enforced by bureaucrats and arbitrated by private companies which are answerable to their shareholders, not to us. We have no say in Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg runs Facebook. If he decides that's not good enough, that's tough. You don't get an if or an and or a maybe. So we have no say and almost no power to challenge these people, and we cannot supervise them. That is clearly a devastating attack on free speech, isn't it? Now, worst of all for me is what happens if we as an electorate come to our senses. We realise that all this hate speech is actually not really hate speech. It's just people expressing opinions that other people don't like, and the people who don't like it are jumping up and down and screaming, and we decide, look, that's just fine, you don't have the right not to be offended, get over yourself. Unfortunately, we can't change that. The EU Code of Conduct will still apply because as long as we're in the EU, we can't change it. One last thing on this. The EU Commission has proposed on the 25th of May, I told you I was writing this last night, that we will be required to use EU ID cards to log on to social media. We don't have ID cards in this country, but that doesn't seem to have stopped them. They want EU ID cards for us to log on to social media. This will, of course, give governments free access to who posted what and when. The anonymity of the internet will be completely gone. Now, I don't think Tim Berners-Lee was quite thinking of that when he came up with the idea of sharing information on a World Wide Web, was he? But let's move on to another example. Now, this, for me, is one of the greatest threats to our liberties that we can have. It's the EAW, the European Arrest Warrant. Now, the European arrest warrant, we are told by the Remain campaign that it is designed to keep us secure, to arrest rapists and murderers and terrorists and criminal masterminds across countries. The truth is that it is a monstrous legal sledgehammer with little discrimination and quite frequently less justice. I'll give you a couple of fairly infamous examples here. Have any of you heard of the name Andrew Symeou? Mr. Symeou was arrested when just 18 in 2008, charged with the murder of a fellow citizen when he'd been on holiday in Greece. Despite the evidence being flimsy, to put it mildly, and the Greek police investigation being castigated by UK judges, the EAW stood. He spent 10 months in prison, awaiting trial, 6 months of that in high security. Of course, he couldn't get bail because he wasn't a Greek citizen. When he finally got his day in court, the Greek judges took one look at the case and threw it out. Witness after witness retracted statements that had been given under violent and intimidatory police interrogation. But 10 months of his life still gone. Another more recent example is Mr. Gary Mann. Now, Mr. Mann was sentenced in Portugal after what is widely recognised as a farce of a trial. He met his lawyer for just 5 minutes before the trial, which was conducted in Portuguese, and he didn't actually know what the charges were until the sentence was passed. He was given 2 years for football hooliganism and subsequently deported to the UK. Due to a mix-up between the Portuguese authorities and the British authorities, we thought the deportation was the sentence. They thought he'd be sent over to Britain to serve 2 years. He was arrested under the EAW again and extradited to Portugal, where he was imprisoned, subsequently returned to the UK in 2011 and released from Wandsworth in August last year. Fair Trials International, which is an international body which checks the fairness of justice process across the world, states of this case, "The European arrest warrant has turned this family's life upside down. Sadly, until it is reformed and we have better standards of justice in Europe, others will suffer the same fate. We are delighted that Gary is finally able to return home, but he should never have been extradited to Portugal following a trial which can only be described as a travesty of justice." But it's not just foreign courts that misuse the EAW. Do any of you remember the Aisha King case? Where the young boy had a brain tumour and he was flown to Spain? Yeah, familiar now? Yeah. His parents were arrested in Spain under a European arrest warrant requested by the Police Constabulary of Hampshire because they wanted to get their son treatment that wasn't available on the local NHS. That's not a crime, last I knew. And I'll quote the Chief Constable, Assistant Chief Constable Hampshire at the time. He stated, "It does not necessarily mean that they would be charged with that offence. It purely gives us the power to arrest, and then we'll be able to speak to them." Not exactly arresting terrorists, is it? But this is the problem. Far from being used against international criminals and masterminds, it is a legislative sledgehammer used against ordinary people for minor incidents, many of which are not even crimes in this country or in the country in which the EAW is being applied. It is simply not reasonable. And you'll note something else that all of these cases had in common. The grounds were utterly debatable. There was no reasonable grounds for a European arrest warrant to be issued in any of these cases. And the prosecution case, well, the less said about that, the better. One of the most important principles of our legal system is habeas corpus. The right that a prisoner must be released from detention where there is no lawful basis for it and be submitted for trial. That's absent entirely from the EAW. Demanding that the prosecution demonstrate there is an a case to answer before extradition is absent from the EAW. It's not included. You can have an alibi and you can prove in a court that, I wasn't there, Gov, I was here, I can prove it. The EAW will still apply, you will still be extradited. It could still leave you sitting waiting to be charged in a foreign court. And if your crime's not a crime under UK law, tough. So anyone thinking of criticising President Erdogan of Turkey to a German friend had better watch out, because they prosecuted a comedian in Germany just a couple of weeks ago for doing precisely that. In a nutshell, the EAW puts citizens at the mercy of overzealous officials with no comeback and no chance to fight back. So, let's think about that when we come to vote. Do we want that? Remain campaigners claim that there are amendments going through the Home Office in 2015. They'll protect us from similar egregious examples. But the EAW is part of EU treaty. UK law does not override EU law, so they have no force. I will finally point out that habeas corpus has been part of British law for centuries. It's considered to date back in English common law to the 12th century. It was formally codified in 1679, which does somewhat put into perspective the Remain campaign's contention that all our human rights would be chucked if we voted to leave. I mean, we had these rights slightly predating the EU. Our rights will predate the EU, they will outlast it, at least as long as we don't subjugate ourselves to it any further. Now, I've got one last couple of things to do, because we're running out of time, and shows you're all running out of patience. But there are two major EU agencies which you should be aware of, which affect our civil liberties. The first is the European Gendarmerie Force, which is based on the French Gendarmerie. It's a paramilitary police force. It was set up in 2006. It is a multinational force with military status, which can enter any EU member state, including this one, with the consent of its government. Fair dues. Unfortunately, once inside the country, it's an EU force. It's not subject to that national government. The national government cannot tell it to leave again. Might want to think about that. The second, it gets worse, is Europol, the criminal intelligence agency of the European Union. Now, nobody is going to say that we should not agree across country, across borders, how we are going to cooperate with police forces. But Europol goes rather further than that. It maintains its own databases, which include data from a variety of sources, including that is not EU countries, and third parties, which are typically commercial. The validity of this data is widely criticised by civil liberties groups, including the Majors, that's MEIGERS Committee, which is a widely respected European organisation dedicated to investigating the impact of EU legislation on the requirements of a democratic constitutional state. And it has stated, since Europol could store data received from non-member states or through circuitous channels, there are serious risks of inaccuracy, and the right to information may well be illusory. And these databases have access, in direct contradiction of Europol's charter, to other databases in the EU. Unfortunately, since, as Alex has demonstrated, there is no proper system for judicial or political oversight of Europol, they give a budget statement once a year. This has not yet been resolved. But that's not the one thing that scares me about Europol. Bad data happens. What scares me is Europol officers have diplomatic immunity. I'm sure we all remember the Mel Gibson film, diplomatic immunity revoked, yeah? We all remember that, but it's not a laughing matter. We are talking about police officers with diplomatic immunity under the control of no government whatsoever. We can't even give them a parking ticket. If these people make a mistake, they're not accountable for it. If Europol screws up and sends an innocent person to prison, or one of their operations causes somebody to get killed, that's tough. Nothing can happen. They are completely and utterly above national law. Now, that really rather scares me, because our traditional model of policing has been by consent, subject to governmental control. The EU quite clearly does not agree. Although I must admit, it fits well with the centralisation of Police Scotland, doesn't it? And the eagerness of Police Scotland to put armed officers on the streets of Inverness in the last 6 months does have a disturbing resemblance to the EU gendarmerie. But that's really quite worrying. So I'm going to close up now because we've got about 10 minutes. What I would like to say is there is a simple and easy solution here. We wrote in 1215, or rather, our English cousins wrote in 1215. No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned or be deceased of his freehold or liberties or free customs or be outlawed or exiled or any otherwise destroyed, nor will we not pass upon him nor condemn him, but by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. We will sell to no man, we will not deny or defer to any man either justice or right. That's clause 29 of Magna Carta, folks. That is completely overridden by the European Court of Justice. Free customs don't apply because they're not held by they're held by precedent. Trial by jury is not part of the Code Napoleon on which the ECJ is based, and that is not how their policing works. We have to realise that there is no defence of the British Constitution at this point. However, there is a solution. We can leave. On June the 23rd, we can leave the European Union. ECJ has no jurisdiction if we leave. If we're out of the EU, Europol has no jurisdiction. And I doubt any British government would give diplomatic immunity to a police force operating on British soil. At least not if they wanted to get re-elected, they wouldn't. If we're out of the EU, we can negotiate our own extradition treaties. The EAW can sod off. We'll do it between ourselves and other countries. If we're out of the EU, any EU gendarme pulling a gun would be committing an act of war. I suspect that won't happen. You see, all we have is the courage to remember our own ancestors' reaction the last time we were faced with domination. And I'm going to quote, you'll like this quote, especially if you're an SNP member. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honour that we are fighting, but for freedom. For that alone, which no true man gives up, but with life itself. Now that's the declaration of our oath, we all know it. But on June the 23rd, the declaration of our oath applies. Do we take freedom into our hands, or do we not? That is the question I think we will answer. Thank you very much. Had to cut that short. Any questions?
A lot of the blame, if you like, to be put onto the EU. And if you go back to 2008 with the financial crisis, it's this notion of having the head was that